This is Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth.
Welcome back, Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Well, when we look at Detroit, we say, okay, there's a city that is paying the price for making promises that it could not keep. And there's a whole host of other things that took place there, but it broke. It finally broke, literally. And some would say, well, that's Detroit, that's Michigan. Okay, we get it. Those happen. But we don't see that in places like New York City, and we certainly don't see it in the state of Texas. May see it in Chicago. May see it in Illinois, maybe Chicago, Illinois. Maybe we'll see it in California and Stockton, but we're not going to see it in responsible states that seemingly are swimming in money because of good management. That would be Texas, certainly. Our guest, Steve Malanga, he is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of the book Shakedown. It is an article that certainly is getting a lot of attention, Steve, and rightfully so. The indebted states of America. States and localities owe far, far more than their citizens know. Well, explain to us the degree of the problem. What are we talking about here, Steve?
Well, I guess you could say, a couple of years ago when people talked about what states owed, it was basically what they had borrowed, and it was in the area of maybe $2.5 trillion. But I guess in the last 5 years, as more and more places have gotten into trouble, people have really been trying to count up what they owe in, whether it's their county, like Cook County, Illinois, or their state, like Texas, but not just the state, but the local governments, or its cities in California. And as they kind of peel back the layers, they've been shocked at how much they found in the way of debt. And one of the latest estimates is that states and localities actually now owe about $7 trillion in the aggregate, which is a lot more than just $2.5 trillion.
That's just astounding. How did we get here? If states within their constitution, don't they have laws against going into debt?
Yeah, they have laws against, first of all, they have laws against deficit financing.
Right.
And they also have laws, basically, which say that when they do go into debt, in terms of borrowing, that the citizens are supposed to either approve it or that there are limits on doing it. And they've essentially ignored these or used legal loopholes to get around them so that, as I say in this piece, it's estimated now that about two-thirds of all municipal debt in America is debt that basically was never approved by taxpayers and is debt that is structured in a way to evade the constitutional restrictions in states against this kind of borrowing. So they're just doing it, and the courts are letting them do it.
Why are the courts letting them do it?
Because courts are filled with judges that are activists in the same way that state legislatures and city councils are filled with politicians who essentially want to spend money. And so it's not true that every court has let them do it. The states that are the most fiscally responsible do have courts that have been willing to say no when taxpayers, for instance, sue and say, to the state, you can't do this. But if you look at states in particular like California, New York, New Jersey, their Supreme Courts just say yes to anything. Their feeling is that even though a constitution says you can't do this, that it's not their purpose as a court to say that the state shouldn't do this. And so, as I said, as one result of that is that the majority of borrowing that states and localities now do is outside of the limits of what reformers over the years have put into state constitutions or city charters or school charters.
Steve, when I'm going to play a clip for you. It's of a councilwoman in Detroit, and she's making a point a number of months ago, right after the election, and here is what she had to say about how Detroit will get and should get bailed out. Roll it.
After the election of Jimmy Carter, the Honorable Coleman Alexander Young, he went to Washington, D.C. He came back home with some bacon. Right. That's what you do. That's what you do. This is our people, in an overwhelming way, supported the re-election of this president, and there ought to be a quid pro quo, and you ought to exercise leadership on that. Of course, not just that, but why not?
Why not, Steve? And are they counting on that?
Well, first of all, that's an example, and she goes all the way back to Coleman Young, who did this work. Remember, we're talking about essentially 1976 when Jimmy Carter took office. What she is expressing is a kind of special interest politics that I call a tin cup urbanism. What that basically means is it was this idea that cities are not responsible for their fiscal future, and that the federal government is the only one that could essentially support cities. And this is an idea which is, by the way, contrary to just about all of human history, because cities have really been the most dynamic forces in human history. But this is an idea that surfaced in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this idea that our cities essentially are not in control of their own destiny. And that idea has basically run out of steam, in part because the federal government has no money, as we all know. They're running huge deficits as it is, and there's no appetite in Washington for these kinds of bailouts. But you still see this idea, and the idea is not only in city council people in Detroit, it's in the minds of unions in places like Chicago, who, even though they are facing a fiscal catastrophe with their pensions, refuse essentially in Illinois to make any concessions whatsoever. And if you actually were to look realistically at their budgets, you would say there's no way they could possibly pay back this debt that they owe without significant changes in concessions, and yet they continue to say no to those things because they must believe that the money is going to come from somewhere. They must believe that if they create a crisis, the federal government will be forced to step in.
Do they have the money now for the current retirees, and does that set up a generational conflict between the people that are now paying in versus the people that are now receiving the benefits?
Well, that's an interesting question because virtually every place, even the places like Chicago that have very, very low levels of funding, some of Chicago's pension funds are only 25% funded, and 75% of their future promises that they've made to people have not been funded yet.
75%? Hold on. 75%?
Have not been funded, yes.
Wow.
Exactly. Exactly. It's extraordinary.
Yes.
But that 25% that's there is enough to keep paying people right now and for a few more years. And so this is kind of the difference between this kind of debt and some of the other debt that we've seen, let's say, in the 70s that New York City and Cleveland and places like that accrued when they went insolvent. We know the liabilities are enormous, but as long as there's any money to keep paying people, there's only been a few places in the country where they're actually, like Pritchard, Alabama, where they actually ran out of money in their pension funds and didn't know anything about it until they completely ran out of money, and then essentially they couldn't even pay current retirees. So there is a little chunk of money, although I would say in Chicago it's so astoundingly small, the amount of money that's there, that you have to be worrying about this. But the larger issue, Crane, is that when the funding levels get to this point now, this low, people who invest in cities, and that means not only people who buy bonds, but also businesses who start businesses there or invest in new plants and stuff, they are starting to realize that there's no way to dig out of this and for a city like Chicago, and that means that there's going to be a lot of pain all around. And so the real impact is in that, people don't want to move to Chicago now with the prospect of property taxes going up 50 to 100%. You're basically buying into this tremendous debt, which you had nothing to do with accumulating.
And municipal bonds, I would think they are one of the safest investments.
Well, not anymore.
Right. Well, that's okay. So what you're saying, I mean, we're looking at a ripple effect all around. I mean, that's pretty huge. And you're describing the problem on a grand scale, and people really don't seem to be getting the picture of just how big this is. When they start to, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. I would say that what's happened is that the unions, I mean, you can't deny the math right now. So I would say the unions in places like Chicago have to see the math. But they know that right now the math is so bad, and they've let this go so long, that the only way to fix it would be essentially massive cuts to benefits, as well as the big increases in taxes, a kind of double dip in which nobody benefits, in a sense. And that's what happens when you let the situation deteriorate to this level. And since that's a political loser, there's nobody who wins from that. Instead, they're doing nothing. And they're doing nothing, I guess, hoping that there's some kind of, federal bailout. And I think they believe, and particularly because you do see newspapers like the New York Times now writing pieces about how it's the moral obligation of the federal government to bail out these pension funds. They believe, as they read these things, that maybe that's what's going to happen.
Or they'll print their own money. Oh, they can't do that. So the federal government's the only place that can do that, and that's what we are seeing. And this is something that is coming down the pike, and we better get ready for it. And you're saying taxes, raising taxes, and cuts in benefits are the only real ways to go for these places. Tell me, what do you say to those who are looking at the cuts and benefits saying, I can't afford that and I need the bailout? This is going to be a big issue, I would think, in the national presidential election in 2016, is it not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Mitt Romney didn't want to make this a big issue, but it was certainly an issue even before, if you will, in 2012. It was certainly an issue then many of us have been writing about this, and I've been on your program many times about it. It was an issue then. Mitt Romney didn't seem to want to make it an issue. He seemed to want to be, conciliatory towards public unions, as if somehow or other he could get those folks to vote for him. I don't think they actually did, nor do I think many of them ever would. So I don't know. I mean, it's very interesting that right now, in terms of polls, and this is very, very preliminary, and nobody's even announced they're running. But if you look at the polls, the person who's leading right now in the polls is New Jersey Governor Christie. Haven't even announced he's running. These are just polls that people float.
20 seconds.
Why do you think he's leading? Because he has been most effective at essentially addressing this issue. Very straightforward. It doesn't mean that he's most qualified to be president, but I think that's probably the single most important reason why, at this point at least, he's
fascinating. Steve Malanga, thank you very much. Wish we had more time. Crane Durham, living on your life. Passion Hero, always faith in Jesus Christ. AFR Talk.